something happened
in the midst of this culture.
What you're describing, your experience is all of a sudden now.
And it's an intentional journey.
And that end is relationship with God.
Welcome to Faith in the Folds, a podcast for ministry and biblical studies and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. Today we have a special episode, a 2023 Harding Anniversary Centennial Lectureship recap with two of my good friends, Luke Dockery and John David Alston. Luke, welcome back to the podcast, sir. How are you today?
Good, Kevin. Thanks for having me on again. It's good to be here with two friends and talk about lectureship that we were at last week.
Yeah. JD, welcome to Faith in the Folds. This, I know this is an absolute highlight, you said, but in your interview for the youth ministry job down here, man, I hope someday I'll get into Faith in the Folds. And here you are, only months in. You've been here shorter than our preacher, and you've already gotten into an episode of Faith in the Folds. Tell us how excited you are to be here today.
Well, thanks for having me. I don't remember wording it exactly like that in my interview, but I am excited to be here, hop on the podcast. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about lectureship, being the first time coming as a minister and not just there as a student. So
yeah, it's one thing that we mentioned on our drive back home was how it feels a little different to no longer be an undergraduate student, but actually to be a graduate student when you go to lectureship. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of the things that I wanted to mention or wanted to talk with y'all about today is just, what are some big takeaways that you got from the Centennial Lectureship at Harding University last week? It was a great time. They had a pretty good attendance, just a lot of great sessions and dynamic and interesting speakers. I know I always have a good time going. I'm very much an extrovert. My friend Luke is a self-described introvert. I think specifically I've heard him say, I don't like people. Or maybe I'm misquoting.
I don't know. It's possible that I said that at some point. I love people in the abstract, and or actually I love people individually. Sometimes in the abstract it's challenging, but
it's harder in the abstract.
The whole just tons of people that you're reconnecting with and having small talk with over and over and over again is not my ideal way to spend a week, but it's still fun to be there and to see old friends, even if I'm exhausted afterwards.
Yeah. And I don't know if you're like me, but afterwards I've been talking so much, it's almost like I'm a little sick, or got a little tickle in the back of my throat. It could be just all the close quarters. But anyway, guys, what is the benefit of going to something like lectureship in the first place? Why even go? And this is kind of a plug for people who should go next year. What's the benefit? Why do something like this?
Well, I guess I'll go first. I think in many ways, lectureship is like any other sort of conference that people kind of go to in professional settings, or usually it's kind of a combination of there's some sort of training or continuing education that you're hoping to receive there. But then there's also like a networking component, making contacts with people or just seeing people that you know from the past. I know from Harding's perspective, lectureship is very intentionally supposed to be for the churches. It's like a gift to the churches to put this on, and all three of us have had benefit of training, biblical training in college settings and in graduate settings. Kevin, you've done your PhD, and so we've been really blessed to get to study scripture and theology and ministry in contexts like that. A lot of people don't get that, or even if they've had it in the past, like they don't get that regularly. And so lectureship can become a place where you can come and get some specialized training, obviously in a less formal setting than school, but still you can pick up some good material. some new ideas that you can go back to your congregation, and hopefully that can be a blessing. I mean, Kevin, you actually spoke this past week at the preachers workshop.
Mhm.
So you did 3 sessions on Colossians, which is basically just like a verbal commentary of the whole book. Matt Love did 3 sessions kind of on the task of preaching. And so, there were like 170 or so people in those sessions, and some of them were like me. I'm not a preacher, but there were dozens and dozens of preachers there. And I can just imagine how many churches will hear lessons on Colossians over the next year or so, based on material that they were able to get from those sessions, and inspiration they were able to get, as Matt kind of walked through different roles that the preacher has. So that's just one example.
Yeah.
I think there were 19 different workshops or tracks at lectureship this year, but one of them was a preaching. And so, it's a form of equipping for the people who come. And then also just getting to see other people, getting to meet new people. And I don't so much mean networking from the standpoint of, career advancement or something like that. But the reality is ministry can be tough. And a benefit of lectureship is that you kind of get to spend time with other people who are in the trenches, so to speak, and are sometimes struggling with some of the same issues, facing the same questions. And it can be really encouraging if you're someone who's kind of isolated in ministry, to come and see lots of old friends and new friends, and just be encouraged by the fact that you're kind of sharing this task together and facing a lot of the same issues.
Yeah. So, Luke, you've been in ministry for 13 years, 17 years, somewhere in there.
13 at one church, my previous congregation, and 4 years now at this church, so 17 in total.
So it's wild to think that some of the students that we ran into this past week at lectureship, they were born right around the time that you were starting in ministry. John David, by the way, who is a ripe old age of 24. This is your first time going to lectureship as a minister. Why even bother going to something like this if you live closer to Mexico than you do to Harding, which is, for those who don't know, Corpus Christi, we're halfway between Houston and Mexico. Why even bother going to something like this? Is it worth the long trek up there?
I would say it's 100% worth the trek. I feel like I almost have kind of a unique situation where, like, it's almost a homecoming for me, because I can go back to Arkansas and see not just friends, but also family there in Searcy, but then also kill 2 birds with 1 stone and get to catch some awesome lectures. I think a big reason for me is definitely networking. I mean, getting to see old professors and be able to talk to them now as like a peer and not just as a student. So that's good, and getting to see them, but also guys and gals that I graduated undergrad with, get to talk with them. And lectureship is among the only time, maybe if we send a few texts throughout the year, but lectureship is a time that I get to see them face to face. And I had some great conversations on like Tuesday night at the Bible alum reception. Some of my friends that are now in ministry and are in California, so even further away from Searcy than I am, but get to talk to them about, hey, how's it going? How's your ministry? How's the church that you're at? What's it looking like? And use that as a time to recognize we're not alone in this, kind of like what Luke was saying, but also like bounce ideas off of each other, figure out, hey, what's working for your youth group? What's working with our youth group? But also make plans for the future. Like a couple of guys that like I graduated with who are now in Texas, getting to talk with them and make plans and be able to do that face to face and see them. I mean, that's something that is undoubtedly helpful, and much easier to do in person than over the phone or over text. Something else that was pretty nice is, just the benefit of being on a college campus. And something that I was able to do while I was there is start recruiting for our internship program that we're going to have, or that we have set up, but then also this upcoming summer, just finding some interns that want to come down to Corpus and get some real world experience in youth ministry. So I was able to do that while we were there. And it's hard to do that. There's not a lot of other excuses someone can come up with to be on a college campus and look for interns besides lectureship or other conferences like lectureship.
Yeah. Yeah. You guys have both mentioned networking. And Luke, you said specifically not necessarily for like career advancement or like change a job or anything like that, but just networking. And part of what is helpful for networking is knowing that that you are not isolated as a minister. Help me dig into that just for a second. Why can, for those who don't know, ministry can feel very isolating. Why is that the case? I mean, we all experience that, but why is that the case? Why do you think?
That's a good question.
That's what I'm here for.
I'm I'm sure there are several reasons that can be true. Sometimes, like I don't feel that in my own situation because I work at a church with a staff of multiple ministers. I work in a town where, there's like 7 or 8 of us who are youth ministers in Churches of Christ in Searcy and the immediate surrounding area. We get together and we plan things together. So I'm just very aware that there's other people that I know and interact with regularly who get it, who are aware of the challenges and are struggling with a lot of the same things that I'm struggling with. But that could be different if you're from a different part of the country, perhaps at a smaller congregation where you're the guy, you're the only person on staff. Perhaps the nearest Church of Christ is 45 minutes or an hour plus away. I mean, I've spoken to preacher groups before that were for an entire state or regional, and there's half a dozen guys because in the Northeast or Midwest
you went up to Montana
northern states
within the last year or two and spoke to a group.
Yeah, a couple years ago. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so the reality is in Churches of Christ, we are predominantly Southern fellowship, in and around the Bible Belt. And so, I mean, I think even in y'all's context down in Corpus, it's a little bit different from either of the places in which you grew up.
Yeah.
And so it's, it can be isolating in that sense because, it's like, there's just not a lot of other people in your shoes if you're not close, if you don't have close geographical proximity to them. So again, that's not necessarily my take, but it is, I think, the perspective of a lot of people. And so it's nice to kind of come back. And another thing on your podcast, Kevin, you've talked about things like minister shortages and ministers leaving ministry. And it seems to me I was going to say every day, that's exaggeration, but frequently it's like I'll hear of some other colleague that I've had in ministry who is stepping out of that to do something else. And it can be really encouraging when you come to something like lectureship and you run into someone who's still doing it.
Yeah.
Who hasn't given up. And I'm not saying anything negative about people who for one reason or another decide to leave ministry. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying it can be really encouraging. In fact, I had a conversation with a guy who said that exact same thing to me. He said, I'm so glad that you're still doing it. Like it makes me feel good every time I see someone who's still doing ministry after all these years.
Yeah.
So I think that's certainly part of it. A lot of the isolation can be just, there's not a lot of people around you who kind of know what it's like to wear the shoes of a minister, whether that's youth ministry like John David and I, or preaching or discipleship ministry like you, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed too is that, it's nice to be in a room full of people. Like, for example, you mentioned the preacher's workshop that Matt Love and I did on Monday of lectureship. There was one time where I mentioned specifically where there in Colossians, it seems like Paul might be expressing some degree of isolation. Like maybe he's feeling it. He's got a team with him there. He mentions that in Colossians 4, but it's not the same. He is imprisoned, and I just mentioned very, very plainly for the audience, I don't have to tell a room full of preachers what it's like to feel isolated. There's something about ministry where when you're the minister, which means like you have all the responsibilities. And the way it has often worked out in our fellowship, you have all the responsibilities, and yet none of the none of the authority, right, to do the kinds of things that, say, elders are able to do, it can put you in kind of a weird spot to where you are, you can be told, all right, we want you to do this, we want you to go in this direction, and so you feel heat from on top, so to speak, and then you feel heat from other people who are unhappy because you're the face, right? You're the public face of the church because you're the one that does most of the speaking. You're the one that people know, especially in a smaller congregation. And that's not to complain about ministry, but just to state a fact of how it goes for a lot of people. I would imagine even in youth ministry is that way to some degree as well, because as the face of whatever ministry you're running, you're the one that naturally receives a lot of the criticism, and hopefully you receive a lot of encouragement as well too. And so just knowing that you're in a room full of people who get it, it's like somebody who went to school with you. I love being able to connect with guys from HST because, like, I know, when we were wanting to hire a youth minister, I hunted, if they weren't involved in some kind of further education, that wasn't necessarily like that was not entirely a deal breaker. But if they were, I wanted to know. It's like, all right, if this guy goes to HST, I know what kind of training he's getting, and I'm really interested in that. And thankfully, we've got John David here. But yeah, just that can be a real problem. You also mentioned networking too. Oh, JD, go ahead.
I was going to say, you also wanted to make sure that they knew how to throw a frisbee was another qualification where you were looking at.
That was absolutely true. Yeah.
Well, something that I was thinking of, like, going off of what both of y'all said, like, I think of it as, this is my first like full-time ministry job, and the vast majority of my ministry experience before this was either at my home congregation where I grew up, or in Searcy, or just in Arkansas in general. And so I think of a lot of the guys that, like, I look up to as mentors and as people who are like helping me out, and people I can like lean back and rely on, like moving 12 hours or 10 and a half hours down south and just not being within like travel distance of going to be able to talk to those guys. Like, but now because of things like lectureship, I can see all of them, and I can get to talk with them. And even if they're not at lectureship, I'm there, and like I go back to my unique experience of being from Arkansas. They traveled into Searcy to come and see me, and I get those relationships still, even through that. And then Luke, like what you were saying, someone coming up to you and saying, like, man, it makes me glad to see you're still in this. Kind of had the same experience where Kevin and I saw an old Frisbee guy who's a youth minister, and he told us that he's been doing this like for 10 years. Like, he hasn't missed a lectureship in 10 years. And just seeing that is awesome. And like encouragement for someone who's like just now getting into it, that even after a decade worth of experience, like, this is still something important to them, whether it be the classes or lectures that they go to and they're able to take away valuable information like the preacher's workshop, or it just be getting up to catch up with old friends who are still at it. I mean, that's definitely, that in and of itself makes it worth the trip.
Yeah. Was that Trenton who we saw?
Yeah.
Shout out to the other TO. You might think Terrell Owens, but shout out to Trenton Osborne for sticking it out in ministry. Yeah. All right, some lectureship highlights. Luke, I know we talked throughout the week. JD, we had a long car ride, 12 hours from Searcy down to Corpus Christi. Luke, tell us some of your highlights of lectureship, the kinds of things that actually get you back there in Searcy. I mean, well, let's back in Searcy, down the street.
Right. Yeah, it's not hard for me to find myself in Searcy these days. I'd never been to the preacher's workshop before. I went to that largely because you and Matt were speaking, and I enjoyed that. I was telling someone one of the things I miss about grad school is being able to kind of like study scripture like a fire hydrant. I mean, just like a whole lot of stuff at a time, like intensive courses. And I kind of felt that flashback to that. I know that you really felt crunched for time with how much material you had to share, but I enjoy that. It's fun for me, so I enjoyed that. One of the best sessions I heard was from Steve Clower, and he did an outstanding job doing a keynote. But actually, his session the next day, he was talking about the spiritual but not religious.
Yeah.
And the way that he kind of broke down that crowd based on a book that he was referencing. But we all know that there's this reality where we are becoming an increasingly post-Christian society, and fewer people are identifying as Christian. But I think it can be easy for us to like take that bit of information and make this leap that, like there's actually a ton of people in this country who are atheist, agnostic, and those numbers are highly on the rise. And Steve shared, data that that's really not the case. We have about 6% atheists, about 6% agnostic, and those categories remain remarkably static. It's really not changing.
It was over a decade. Those numbers had not changed significantly.
That's right.
I wanted to get Steve on the podcast to talk about that kind of thing, but I was surprised. I thought surely it's more than that. But yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and so instead, a lot of these people that are kind of checking out of traditional church are either in the I like Jesus but not the church crowd, and there's kind of different reasons for that. But these are people who are pretty open to spiritual conversations, but for one reason or another have become disconnected from local churches. And then there's also kind of the nothing in particular. If you imagine like checking a survey, like what's your religion? Nothing in particular. Yeah. And a lot of times, again, these are people who maybe are less churched than the I like Jesus but not the church crowd, but are usually fairly open to spiritual perspectives. Maybe don't have a lot of Christian baggage, like they might not have much Christian past at all. And basically, the takeaway from this, which was quite hopeful from Steve, is these are the groups that are actually growing, and they're actually potentially pretty fertile ground for conversation about faith and evangelism and discipleship. And so it can be easy to hear, post-Christian America, and that become a fearful thing. But I really felt that Steve's presentation made it kind of a hopeful thing.
Yeah.
Because most of these folks are people who were not, too far gone or highly resistant to conversations about faith.
Yeah. I can't remember whose lecture it was, but I want to say it was maybe in one of the keynotes, where someone is indicating that, the way that culture is going now, what we will start seeing more of is people who have had some prior exposure to Christianity and have rejected that, rather than people who are just unfamiliar with Christianity. And I believe the speaker was saying that might actually create more resistance to spreading and sharing the gospel. I can't remember who said that, but I think Steve's point kind of balances that out, where if there is this growing group of folks who are relatively unchurched, I would think that means that they have not had any significant prior exposure to Christianity. So maybe the Christianity that they're rejecting is, the kind that the three of us would say, yeah, that's not where we are either. I don't know. Luke, do you remember that one?
Yeah, I think maybe it might have been one of Matt Love's presentations. I think he had a quote from Leslie Newbegin, where he was talking about some of that.
Yeah, that sounds right.
But I do think I think what we're finding ourselves in are a lot of people, what they're walking away from is not really historic Christianity and like a deep understanding of like, this is what Christians have believed for 2,000 years. We don't buy this anymore, and we're leaving that behind. But instead, a lot of them are walking away kind of from like some kind of mixture of like cultural Christianity and like civic religion and kind of like moralism. And so I do think there might be some extra work there, but I think it's an opportunity to also kind of distinguish between, well, like you say that this is the faith that you're walking away from. Well, I would have walked away from that too. here's what I actually believe and
Mhm.
what I think that Christians have believed for a long time. So all that to say, Steve's presentation was really helpful. I also went to on Tuesday afternoon a 3-part track on disciple making with I might not get his last name right because it is long and I think Dutch in origin. Paul Hugobart. But he did some really good stuff where he kind of talked about places like what is disciple making, why do we need it now, and what are some characteristics of places, disciple making movements where it's actually being very successful. What are some characteristics that we see in those movements that could help us maybe think about our own contexts?
Yeah.
So that was some really helpful stuff. Some information I was familiar with, but a lot of new information. So
Yeah,
for me, those
great.
were some highlights.
Nice. JD, what about you, man?
Yeah, I definitely didn't catch as many lectures as I wanted to, but the ones that I did catch, I really enjoyed. I got the morning sessions of the Neller workshop, which I have been excited about the Preachers Workshop since the Preachers Conference back in February. And I know Devin always puts on a good workshop, and then you and Matt did a great job. And just being able to use that time to dive deeper into the text. Those are always, even as an undergrad, those were always the classes that I thoroughly looked forward to. The ones who took a deep dive was more exegetical in nature rather than pastoral or some other kind of track. So I thoroughly enjoyed diving into Colossians, and we talked about this a little bit on the drive back. Colossians 3 has always been among my favorite chapters in the Bible. Just setting your mind on Christ and recognizing the change from what you're doing now and what you were doing then. So I thoroughly enjoyed the Preachers Workshop, being able to take that information back here. And I know at some point the youth group at King's Crossing and I will definitely be diving into Colossians and some of Paul's letters. And so anything that I can take away and dive into the exegesis of that is definitely something that I look forward to. One of the other lectures that I caught that I was actually very, very interested in was one of Dr. Manners, and it was not quite a Colossians lecture. He was actually diving into the archaeology and the history of Pergamum.
Mhm.
And so I went and I sat in on that for a little bit, and it was just so interesting. And he was comparing, just hearing him hearing him talk about it and comparing the actual world of what's going on in a city like Pergamum with its hundreds of different temples from hundreds of different gods and stuff, and comparing that to kind of what we see Paul talk about, but also mainly John's letter in Revelation to Pergamum, and then comparing that to the church in that time period. And it brings a whole new perspective, because we read Paul's letters, or we read John's letters in Revelation, or Jesus' letters in Revelation, and we think about it yeah, we know they're dealing with hard stuff, we know they're dealing with paganism and dealing with all these different things, but to actually put it in a real context of, man, they've got 40 temples to 40 different gods doing 40 different things right down the road from where their church is, puts that in a whole new perspective that we don't really have in today's world. From my apartment to King's Crossing, I pass 5 churches. I think that's right. Or maybe I'm just thinking of all the different churches on Yorktown, which is where our church is located. I know I pass at least 2 Baptist church, a non-denom, and a Catholic church that is called John the Baptist Catholic Church. I
There's
love
also a
calling
Methodist
that the super church. A
Um,
Methodist church.
and that's before you get to King's Crossing, so that's 5
And that's
churches.
before King's Crossing. And then there's at least 2 more. I know there's one across from where y'all are, off of Yorktown. Maybe there's one more over there. And sure, they're different denominations. Sure, we have different worship orders of worship and stuff like that. But Lord willing, we all believe in Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection. So we're not competing with each other in that regards. We're not advocating other gods in that regards. Whereas back in Pergamum, like that's not at all what they were dealing with. They weren't sure, they were dealing with maybe a little bit different views of who Jesus was, but they're also dealing with views of, well, no, we follow Zeus. No, we follow Athena. No, we follow, and fill in the blank of whatever Greek god it is. So hearing Dr. Manor, obviously a very well-known archaeologist, just hearing him talk about that and bring like real life facts of what they have found today, and that was, it brings a whole new context to these passages than what we get from just reading the words. Another lecture that I got to catch was from one of my best friends, Shane. He and Elijah Swindle co-teamed Colossians 3 all the way through 4:6. And I knew they would do a good breakdown of the text as well as pastoral. And so that was one of the biggest reasons I wanted to catch it. But I made jokes with Shane about they gave the hardest text to a youth minister and having to talk about the household codes in Colossians 3.
Yeah.
But I really love the way that Shane broke it down and bringing everything back to like do as Christ would do. I mean, the whole chapter starts out with, since you have been raised with Christ, set your minds on where Christ is, above, next to God, and relating that to the household codes. And Paul isn't breaking grounds with how we should be acting. He is simply showing all these different groups of people, whether it be fathers or husbands or wives or masters or slaves, all of these things are just in and of themselves examples of how Christ would be acting. And so what I loved that he did was he went case by case, husbands, fathers, wives, and he did Christ as this, Christ as son, Christ as father, Christ as husband, Christ as wife.
Yeah.
And he pulled in he talking about equal relationships, and he pulled in Philippians 2, which I just thought an amazing correlation. Jesus not finding being equal with God as something to be grasped, and so he humbled himself. And so I loved the way he did it. I made fun of him. I told him that he dodged the question of submission afterwards, but that's okay because I thought he did a really good job explaining what he was trying to get across. So just hearing like him shed light on that argument in a different way that I hadn't really heard before was really good to catch that. And that was the last lecture of lectureship. That was 4:00 Wednesdays. So,
Man, yeah.
But that was good. I enjoyed all of those.
Yeah. I really liked Matt's sessions in the preacher workshop. I mean, of course, I enjoyed getting to do mine on Colossians. I think Matt said that it was like listening to a commentary on audio book, which I felt like that was the assignment, right? So that's what I went for. But Matt's first session there, where he and I were tag teaming those sections. I went into it thinking, okay, Matt is going to show here's a funny story how to like illustrate some point in Colossians 1, or like here's some poignant anecdote or something like that. And that's not at all what Matt did. What Matt did was he posed this question, like what's the rhetorical feature of a rhetorical function of this passage, and how therefore can we model that in our preaching? And so he had this great clip of a preacher who was not preaching on Colossians, but Matt's point was, there in Colossians 1:15 through 20, there's one of the highest statements of Christology in the New Testament, where it's like a statement of praise almost, and there's some other sections in there too that particularly are offering praise in there in chapter 1. So Matt showed us this clip, or played for this clip of a preacher who whose sermon was so moving that it sounded like it was worship in and of itself. It sounded like the preacher was worshiping. And Matt's point was, can the people in our congregation tell that we are worshiping when we're preaching? If the passage that you've got on hand is a passage of admonition and warning, then let your sermon lean toward that. If your passage is towards, is geared more towards encouragement or teaching, something along those lines, let the text kind of guide you and model that way. I mentioned it in my very first session. I don't love preaching. I don't specifically, I don't think I'm great at it, partly because I don't have a lot of like funny stories, like I don't think that I've got, all these great poignant little, anecdotes and, poems and everything else that, that preachers have, that they just have, 30 years worth of stories where every random trip down to, McDonald's is a hilarious adventure, or they, end up baptizing somebody in the fountain out front. I don't have all that, But as I was listening to Matt, I remember for the first time in a long time getting excited about, man, like I've actually got something really serious here that could help me preach this more effectively. And so that was pretty neat. We mentioned Steve Clower's lecture earlier. Bob Turner and Juan Meza did a great job. A couple of guys I know pretty well at the White Station Church of Christ in Memphis. They talked about how their church's multicultural ministry, and didn't necessarily give a list of do's and don'ts, but you gave us some things to think about and how to actually approach that kind of ministry effectively, rather than having just your predominant culture church, which in their context is a predominantly Anglo church, and then having an iglesia attached to it, not unlike some that you've talked about before, Luke, with your one-eared Mickey Mouse, where you have like the main body of the church, right? And then somewhat connected to that, you have your youth ministry. One time I was explaining that model to John David, and I mentioned the one-eared Mickey Mouse, and I pointed over to the whiteboard in our office. However, our preacher was standing next to the whiteboard, and our preacher is deaf in one ear. And so John David thought that I was talking about our preacher. And then later on in the afternoon, he asked me about it, and I was like, no. I wasn't burning on Nathan. I was talking about this model for youth ministry that is unhealthy. So, Nathan, if you're listening to this, I love you, man. We'll get you on the podcast soon, okay? But the trouble with doing like an Anglo church and then the Iglesia is like you don't technically have one church, right? You've got two. And so they were showing how they have tried, and sometimes more successfully, sometimes less successfully, to actually work through that. But the way that Juan and Bob modeled that mutual love and respect and admiration for each other, I thought was really admirable, and I really appreciated that. Guys, as we wrap up, what's something really, other than all the lectures and things that we've talked about, what's something really meaningful that you plan to take from lectureship and begin incorporating into your preaching and teaching and your classes coming up?
I think one thing I would say, and this is maybe not so much my preaching and teaching, but some of just my practice of ministry. I went to a youth ministry lecture where I was just given some good reminders of kind of some basic things that, I know, but you can still kind of get away from at times. And so just some wise practices in terms of trying to partner with parents and things like that. And then also I mentioned earlier the disciple making session, and one of the principle number one of places where disciple making is happening, and we're actually seeing like people becoming Christian, largely in the global South, actually. But all of these places, one thing they had in common was a deep reliance on the Holy Spirit, as evidenced in extended periods of prayer and fasting. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think a reason why we struggle with a lot of this in North American churches is because we don't do those things, or at least we don't do them well. On a congregational level, we don't pray a lot together. We don't fast well or frequently or maybe ever. And so just a conviction of, okay, like I'm in an established, pretty healthy church, but being honest, like that's not a significant part of our DNA. And so what might it look like to try to help bring about change within our culture, where this just becomes a part of who we are, not even as a means to some other end, but just because like we want to be like biblical. We want to be like the church that Jesus and his apostles set up, and this was a huge part of what they did. And that's not something that we do so much. So I was deeply convicted about that, and yeah, looking forward. That's something that I want to see how we can incorporate that into our communal practices at Cloverdale.
Yeah, I have noticed in really in my own life that if there's something that I'm either struggling with or something that is kind of stressing me out, or just something where like I'm anxious, you know what I mean. At some point it'll hit me. It's like, man, I haven't prayed very much about this. Or no wonder I'm feeling anxious about this, right? And it's not as if, okay, I've prayed once and boom, I'm good to go, right? There's it's blue skies and rainbows after that. And that's not the case. But it's the assurance to me that I have kind of retrained myself to turn over these important things to God and to relearn trust and faithfulness in those moments. And it's hard. I shared that quote, that George MacDonald quote, in my last session on Colossians, where George MacDonald is in for those who aren't familiar, George MacDonald, old Scottish preacher's big influence on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. He's got this great quote, where he's kind of in mock dialogue, and he says, all right, now what if, why, if God knows everything that I need, if he knows better than I do, what is good for me, why should I pray in the first place? To which I respond, what if God knows that prayer is the thing you need most? And goodness, man, that has just stuck with me for years, ever since I first came across that quote. What if that time of intentional focus and offering up to God is precisely what I need in order to remind myself, like you said, being reminded that God can handle it and will handle it. I must learn to trust. That's absolutely huge. So, JD, what about you?
Yeah, just like reflecting on that, I remember having a conversation like with someone at lectureship, and then also just thinking about like our teens and stuff, and this idea of like total reliance on God through, and showing that like through like our prayer and study. And you also think of Colossians 3, like setting your mind like on things above with Christ, and like that is like a huge theme throughout the chapter, yet we find ourselves not always like doing that. And I was having a conversation with someone at lectureship, and we were talking about like prayer and how our ministry is outside of the actual acts of things like that we're doing. Like how are you, in a sense, how are you taking care of yourself? And I always tell people, like, I can notice the difference in the days when I start out the day in prayer, in scripture, and devoting that time to God, and the difference between those days and the days where I'm not doing that. And then you look back, and the next day when you do it, and you ask yourself the question, well, why would I ever stop doing this? And so finding that time to pray and have that trust and reliance, and take that back, like everything that we've learned, take that and bringing it back, maybe just in that, because like with Luke, kind of what he said, like there's a lot of things that I might not ever be able to truly bring into class or bring into my teaching and be like, hey, look at this little nugget of information that I was able to pull from this class at lectureship. I might not be able to do that, especially with talking to teenagers. It can be a little bit harder than if talking to adults. But I can be faithful with the information that I have been given and use that in my own personal life. And when your own personal life is affected by the gospel and affected by the love of Christ, then that is going to in turn infect or affect like your ministry. And so, yeah, definitely leaning into that stuff. I would say the biggest takeaway that I would have from lectureship is seeing all of these different models of study and people like treating the text like faithfully and diving into it from all these different avenues. Because I notice like our need in our youth group, and this is true probably across the board, but we have our kids who don't quite understand what is church, what do we believe, these certain things. But I also have my teens that want to dive into text deeper, and they want to grow in their knowledge of scripture. And so seeing all these different models of study and faithfully dealing with the text, like taking those models and being able to apply them to my own study so I can meet the needs of these kids who might not understand. Well, what is church? Who is God? Who is Jesus? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? But also use that study to bless the kids who know all these things, at least know them better than some of my other kids, but also want to take it the step further and say, well, what does this text actually mean? What is this actually diving into? And having seen people do it faithfully at lectureship, bringing that back here and try and do it faithfully myself to then bless our teens. As far as just getting a nugget of information from a class, might never see the light of day, but the principles are there, and the groundwork is there to be able to come and bless my ministry in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that and we could probably say this is another benefit of going to lectureship in the first place. Takeaway that I have is that my work matters. My work as a minister matters, because I had the opportunity to go and use those skills that I've very graciously been given and bless others. With those 3 sessions on Colossians, and that was incredibly meaningful to see old friends in there, like Luke and Justin, to see you in there, JD, so colleagues in there, to see other people that I've partnered with in various ways, people that I have looked up to for well over a decade. Goodness, Paul Pollard was in one of those sessions. Devin Swindle was in one of those sessions. And for all of us to be in there together, like, what I'm doing, what any speaker's doing, really matters. It really matters, and that's really affirming. When we're feeling isolated in our ministry, we can begin to question and wonder, does what I do on a day-to-day basis actually matter? And going to something like lectureship is a really forceful reminder. Yeah, it absolutely does matter. Along similar lines too, and I didn't pose this question in order to set up a commercial for Regnum Media, but that's what we're going to have right now. It's a commercial for Regnum. Luke, how many times were we talking with somebody and they would either ask us, hey, when are you coming out with material on this book or that book? Or, I walked a retired professor from the Bible building into the student center and said, hey, look, you need to check out this book right here that Luke wrote on Ecclesiastes, because I think this is doing much the same kind of stuff that you're saying that we need to offer our churches. It was incredibly cool to have a number of people come up and ask us about when is, a book on this or that topic or this or that book of the Bible going to come out? Because that is precisely why, Luke, you pitched this idea to me in the first place a couple of years ago. So there's a real need for material like this to get out and into the hands of ministers who are in the trenches. And it was so incredibly affirming to see, old friends be excited, not just to see you, but excited about, what we're in the process of offering. And so that was really cool. Luke, you want to have any final comments on Regnum before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would just say it was interesting because if you remember a year ago, it was at Lectureship that we announced this in any sort of real way. Like, hey, this is something we're going to do. It's something that's coming, and people were excited about it. But it was also kind of like okay, like that sounds good, but but there was no tangible product. And so in the intervening year, we've released 2 books. The book that you were just holding up on Ecclesiastes came out in March, and then a book that we just released on baptism, assembly, and the Lord's Supper.
John David has that one right here for those
John
who are
David has
watching.
that one, yeah, by John Mark Hicks, which came out just a couple weeks ago. And so it was nice now because we're on the other side of this, and so there are a lot of people who are like, hey, I got your book, it was really good, I'm preaching through it, or it's been helpful for our church, and what else do you have coming out? And of course we work in partnership with the Center for Christian Studies, and they had a table at Lectureship, and they were just swarmed by people. I mean, just all over the place. We were actually struggling. We kept trying to meet during the week, and we just couldn't do it because there was no break in the traffic that they were seeing. So that's good. And I just, like you said, it was really affirming, because if you've been on the side of trying to find adult class material where you can, something that's good, that is also teachable, and you can hand it off to someone, if you've been in those situations, that there's just not a lot of that material. And so I think a lot of people are seeing hey, this is something that's good, that's trustworthy, and that can be really useful in our church ministries. And also we're trying to format all these things where they're useful in Bible class settings, but also just for personal individual reading and discipleship. And so yeah, it's like you said, it's very affirming, and excited about the future and having more and more resources that we can use to hopefully bless churches.
Yeah. One final plug there for the Center for Christian Studies, run by Keith Stanglin, and Todd Hall is a big part of that as well. Those guys do a lot of great work with the video curriculum on church history and ethics and things like that. Keith actually came to Cloverdale Church of Christ Sunday of Lectureship, right? And did a whole big session on on a biblical view of sexuality, God's intention for human sexuality. I saw the flyer that went out for that. Looked like a fascinating series of lectures. You were able to go to several of those, right, Luke?
I did. Yeah, Keith did a great job, and really just, I would say, he got down in the weeds and talked about specific issues, but also really just trying to lay out a healthy, kind of biblical theology of sexuality. Sometimes we've been pretty good at knowing certain verses that are relevant to the topic at hand, but we don't really have necessarily a healthy theological view of what is sexuality from God's perspective. And so Keith really, there's a video curriculum course on the Center for Christian Studies website that churches can purchase and use, and then also he's available to come around and travel and do seminars like he did for us. But just really helpful, I think, to establish kind of a positive vision for what God is intending from the beginning, as a baseline, as a foundation, and then from there you can go and engage some of these other challenging and very culturally relevant issues. But sometimes we do the second thing without first establishing kind of the biblical foundation. And I think that gets us on the wrong foot. So all that to say, Keith did a really good job for us. And that's some of the stuff that CCS does. They also put out a journal, a lot of good resources for, preachers, ministers, Bible teachers who want to be theologically well-informed.
Yeah. Yeah. Another good reason to go to lectureship, you get exposure to all this kind of stuff that's happening, a lot of neat things that are available just out and about, and lectureship is a good place to find those. Well, guys, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate y'all tuning in. And there's a couple of other exciting things coming up on Faith in the Folds. Be sure to stay tuned for that, and we will see you all next time. Bye-bye.